and I'm here to share with you week 6 of the DMC Bible reading plan, where we cover Isaac. Now, here we see two main characters, Abraham and Isaac. And for Abraham, we see him witnessing the fulfillment of God's covenant at the twilight of his life, while Isaac, we see him as the fulfillment and continuation of that covenant. Now, in Genesis 22, sacrifice of Isaac, we see Abraham come in the full maturity of his faith. Whereas in the past, he used to question God when he's asked to do things. He's hesitant or even fearful, and he does things out of that fear. But here, we see he has no more doubt or no more hesitating. He just acts. And when asked by Isaac, where is the sacrifice? He just replies, God will provide, with certainty and faith there. Now, what was going on for him when he had to sacrifice his Isaac? Just like sometimes we are asked to sacrifice our Isaacs, our most cherished dreams. But in Hebrews 11:17-19, we are told that his faith was such that he believed that God could raise Isaac from the dead if needed. That was, we see now him in the full development of his faith. Whereas for Isaac, we don't hear so much, but we know these main points here. First, he was not a small boy. He was probably in his mid-teens or early 20s, based on the timeline and the fact that he would carry all that firewood needed for a sacrifice. Second, he knew what was happening. In verse 7, he asked his father, where is the sacrifice? So he knew something was happening. And thirdly, we realize that he didn't go back with Abraham. He went his separate way. So something happened there. And we may find out later what may that be. Another point also was that child sacrifice was practiced in the biblical times. So much so that Leviticus 20, verses 2-5, God explicitly states against child sacrifice. And this, for me, shows how the God of Abraham is different from all the other gods, where faith is far more important than sacrifice. And continuing on in Genesis 24, where Abraham searches for a wife for Isaac, here we see the continuation of the covenant, and that we need to be active participants of that. Now, just because Isaac was born doesn't mean that the covenant and the promise is over. You know, it just will go on. Abraham had to look for a wife for Isaac to make sure it continues on. So we do need to be active and not just sit back. Okay, it's done, and we just let God do the rest. Second, also, we see how Abraham wants Eliezer not to bring Isaac back to Mesopotamia, and he wants him twice. That strikes me as how that when we are in a covenant with God, we don't turn back to where we used to be or where we came from, even when times are tough. Let's not be like the Israelites who were free from slavery and wanted to go back to Egypt because they were wandering in the desert and times got tough. They didn't have the faith for that. As for disciples as well, when they went back to fishing after Jesus died, and Jesus had to appear and to call them back to the ministry as well. Another thing that struck me also was how Eliezer was there at the start of Abraham's faith journey. And so he got to see how Abraham grew to the man of faith that we read now. And he learned from Abraham how he followed his footsteps and how he prayed to God, and God answered him even before he had finished praying. Finally, we also learn about God the Comforter. And Isaac was comforted at the end of Genesis 24 when God brought Rebekah to him. And he said that he was comforted by Rebekah after the death of his mother, and also probably the sacrifice. In Isaiah 54, verse 1-10, we are reminded also that suffering will come, but it's only for a moment. However, God's mercies and his grace are never ending. And in verse 10, it says, my covenant of peace will not be removed. I hope you've all been blessed by this week's reading and can take time to pause and reflect on that. Selah.